The golden sunlight bathed the park in a warm glow, painting soft shadows across the paths and the tranquil pond. Morgan Blake sat on a bench near the water, her lean frame relaxed, but her senses quietly alert. The simple gray t-shirt and jeans she wore concealed the strength of someone who had been forged in battle. The faint scar on her forearm a subtle clue to her past as a Navy SEAL. She took in her surroundings, more out of habit than suspicion, an automatic response honed over years of service. Her eyes swept the park as she catalogued its rhythm, children laughing on swings, a jogger's steady pace, and a group of teenagers lingering too long near the playground. Everything seemed ordinary, but her instincts caught a slight shift in the air, a subtle unease that was difficult to pinpoint. Across the park, 4 men loitered beneath the spreading branches of an old oak tree. Their sharp laughter pierced the peaceful ambience, carrying a cruel edge that grated against the stillness. The leader, a tall man with broad shoulders clad in a black hoodie, leaned against the tree with the swagger of someone used to getting his way. Gary "Tank" Walker wasn't the kind of man who faded into the background. His shaved head gleamed in the sunlight, and the faded tattoo creeping up his neck spoke of a life lived on the margins. Tank nudged the wiry man next to him, whose patchy beard did little to hide his smirking expression. He gestured toward Morgan with a sneer. "That one," Tank muttered, low enough that only his crew could hear. "Sitting there all smug like she owns the place. Easy pickings." Patchy Beard snickered, cracking his knuckles. "Think she'll fight back?" Tank's grin widened. "She'll try. They always do." Morgan felt their eyes on her before she saw them. A faint prickle traveled down her spine, her body tensing almost imperceptibly. Slowly she turned her head, catching their stares for a brief moment. They didn't look away, confirming her suspicion. Trouble. Her muscles relaxed again, a casual pose masking the rapid calculations running through her mind. 4 men. Leader, broad-shouldered. Second, wiry, the other 2 younger, probably early 20s. Radiated overconfidence. Their cocky swagger matched the faint odor of cigarettes and cheap cologne wafting her way. She noted their spacing and body language, her mind already mapping the angles and distances. Morgan let the faintest smirk touch her lips. "All right, gentlemen, let's see what you've got." The men began to approach, their voices growing louder as they crossed the park. Tank took the lead, his gait slow and deliberate, while the others flanked him like predators closing in on prey. A few onlookers glanced over but quickly averted their eyes, unwilling to intervene. Morgan didn't move. She shifted slightly on the bench, her relaxed posture baiting them further. Her calm demeanor masked the sharp edge of her readiness. These men were accustomed to preying on the fearful, exploiting hesitation. They had no idea what they were walking into. Tank stopped at the edge of the gravel path, his boots crunching against the stones. His smirk widened, revealing yellowed teeth, while his crew formed a loose semicircle around Morgan's bench. "Afternoon, ma'am," Tank said, his voice a syrupy mockery of politeness. "Mighty nice day for sitting out here all alone, don't you think?" Morgan's gaze rose slowly, meeting his with steady calm. Her expression betrayed neither fear nor anger, just quiet control. "It is," she replied evenly. "What do you want?" Tank chuckled, glancing back at his crew as if she'd told a joke. "Now, that's no way to greet friendly folks just out for a chat. You got something against a few good old boys stopping by to say hi?" Patchy Beard leaned in, his grin as sickly as his yellowed teeth. "Or maybe she thinks she's too good for the likes of us, huh, Tank?" Morgan didn't flinch. Her calm stare cut through their mockery like a blade, the faintest shift in her posture signaling that this encounter was far from one-sided. The men might think they had chosen their next victim, but Morgan knew better. They were about to realize their mistake. Morgan didn't respond, her gaze flitting between them, studying their postures and calculating distances. They were too close now, close enough that any sudden move could ignite the tension hanging in the air. Her body remained still, but her mind worked quickly, analyzing their movements, preparing for what she knew was coming. "You hear me, lady?" Patchy Beard's voice turned sharp, his patience fraying. "You think you're better than us?" One of the younger men, his face red from sunburn, sneered, his voice laced with disdain. "Bet she's one of those uppity types, thinking this park belongs to her kind." Morgan's jaw tightened, but her voice remained steady. "I don't think anything belongs to me. I'm just sitting here, minding my business." "Oh, you hear that, boys?" Tank drawled, stepping closer, his grin widening. "She's just minding her business. Guess we'll mind it for her. He gestured toward the bag resting on the bench beside Morgan. That's a nice bag. Bet there's something good in it. Why don't you be polite and hand it over? We wouldn't want things to get messy. Morgan's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smirk. Is that what you call polite these days? Stealing from people who look like me? Tank's face darkened, his grin fading as irritation flashed in his eyes. Now what's that supposed to mean? You know exactly what it means, Morgan shot back, her voice like ice. You didn't pick me because I'm sitting alone. You picked me because you think I'm an easy target. The youngest of the group stepped forward, his voice rising with anger. You got a mouth on you, huh? Probably the same one you use to cry racism every time something doesn't go your way, he said. Morgan rose to her feet, her movements slow and deliberate. The act of standing subtly shifted the dynamic. Though shorter than Tank, she carried herself with a quiet authority that unsettled them, even if they wouldn't admit it. Her unwavering gaze met theirs, each word she spoke a challenge. Do you really think this is going to go the way you planned? Her voice was calm, controlled. Walk away. While you still can. Patchy Beard laughed, though the nervous edge in his tone betrayed his bravado. Look at her, trying to act tough. What are you gonna do, lady? Call the cops? Like they'd show up for someone like you. The younger men joined in, their laughter growing louder, emboldened by their twisted camaraderie. Tank stepped closer, his smirk replaced by a cold glare. The tension between them thickened, the moment teetering on the edge of violence. Morgan could feel the shift. This was it, the tipping point. I don't think you're listening, lady, Tank said, his voice dropping to a venomous growl. We're taking that bag, and maybe we'll take something else too. Morgan's pulse quickened, not from fear, but from the electric anticipation of what was about to unfold. Her SEAL training kicked in, her mind running through options, escape routes, and weaknesses in their positions. Stay calm, control the situation, strike decisively when the time came. Her hands, appearing relaxed at her sides, subtly shifted into readiness. Tank leaned in, his breath sour and his voice dripping with menace. This ain't a game. Give us the damn bag, or we'll show you what happens when you don't respect your betters. Ridders? Morgan's gaze didn't waver. Her tone was steel. You're going to regret this. She gripped the strap of her bag and stood fully, her movements deliberate. Her body radiated tension, but her face remained calm, unreadable. The men exchanged mocking glances, sneers curling their lips, but Morgan gave nothing away. Adjusting the strap over her shoulder, she spoke evenly. I've got somewhere to be. Without waiting for a response, she turned and began walking. Her steps were measured, her breathing controlled. She resisted the urge to run. Running would only embolden them. She was aware of every sound behind her, their voices rising, taunting, jeering. Footsteps crunching on gravel as they followed. Hey, where are you going? One of the younger men called, mockery thick in his tone. We're not done talking, lady. Morgan didn't turn, keeping her pace steady, her senses on high alert. The tree-lined path ahead seemed quieter now, too far removed from the bustling parts of the park. She noted her surroundings, searching for an exit, but the footsteps grew louder, closer. Come on now, don't be like that, Patchy Beard jeered. Ain't you used to folks like us talking to you, or are you too good for that? Her jaw tightened, her body coiled like a spring. She turned a corner, expecting the main thoroughfare to come into view, but stopped abruptly. The clearing ahead was wide and open, too open. She'd underestimated their speed. They were already there, spreading out in a loose semicircle to block her path. The trap had been sprung, but Morgan didn't falter. Instead, she stood taller, her eyes narrowing as she prepared to remind them just how badly they had miscalculated. Tank stood at the center, his broad shoulders squared, a smug grin plastered across his face, daring Morgan to make a move. Patchy Beard stood to his right, cracking his knuckles with an exaggerated flair, while the two younger men leaned casually against nearby trees, their postures dripping with overconfidence. Well now, Tank drawled, his voice laced with mock politeness. Look at you, all cornered. Bet you didn't see this one coming, did you? Morgan glanced behind her, noting that one of the younger men had circled back to block her exit. She was boxed in. Her eyes flicked between them, reading their stances and movements. Though her body remained calm, her mind was racing. There was no reasoning with men like these. Tank took a deliberate step forward, his grin widening. You lost, sweetheart? This ain't your part of town. Eddie dropped down. Morgan met his gaze, her voice calm but cold. I'm not lost. Now if you'll move, I'll be on my way. Patchybeard chuckled, stepping closer. His grin twisted into something cruel. Oh, you think you can just walk away? Like we're just gonna let you? Nah, lady, you don't get it. This ain't a free ride for your kind. Morgan's jaw tightened, but her expression remained neutral. I don't want any trouble. Oh, we know you don't, Tank sneered. People like you never do. Just want to sit there all smug, acting like you belong, like you can just take up space like the rest of us. But see, that's the thing. You don't. One of the younger men pushed off the tree, pointing at Morgan with a shaky finger. She thinks she's better than us. You see it, right? The way she looks at us? Like she's too good. Probably one of those types who cries racism whenever things don't go her way. Yeah, Patchybeard added, his tone sharpening. Bet she's had it easy her whole life. Probably never worked for nothing. Everything handed to her because of some pity sob story. Morgan exhaled sharply, her patience wearing thin. You don't know anything about me. Tank's sneer deepened, his eyes narrowing. Oh, I know enough. You're just like the rest of them, always looking for a handout, expecting everyone else to step aside. Well, guess what? Not today. Morgan shifted slightly, adjusting her stance, her calm, steely gaze locked on them. I've already warned you. Walk away, and this ends here. Patchybeard laughed loudly, though there was an edge of nervousness beneath it. Warn us? Listen to her, Tank. Think she's in charge here? You ain't in charge of nothing, lady. Tank growled, his tone darkening. You're gonna hand over that bag and maybe, just maybe, we'll let you walk out of here without a bruise. Morgan scanned their faces, her instincts sharp. This wasn't about the bag. It never had been. This was about power. About making her feel small, forcing her to submit. They wanted a show, but she wasn't about to give them what they were expecting. Her voice, sharp and steady, cut through the air. You've had your chance. The words were barely out of her mouth before one of the younger men lunged at her. Morgan sidestepped smoothly, her movements precise and controlled. She didn't strike, not yet. Her instincts told her to act decisively, but she needed them to cross the line completely. Tank's face twisted in rage as he barked, What are you waiting for? Get her! The younger man lunged again, this time with more force. Morgan moved instinctively, stepping aside and grabbing his arm in one fluid motion. Using his momentum against him, she twisted sharply, sending him sprawling to the ground with a pained yelp. He groaned, clutching his arm as he rolled onto his side, momentarily out of the fight. The group froze for a beat, their faces shifting from smug confidence to stunned disbelief. Morgan's eyes swept over them as she adjusted the strap of her bag over her shoulder, her stance calm but unyielding. Her voice carried a quiet authority that sliced through the silence. I told you to walk away. Patchybeard sneered, but the hesitation in his movements was obvious. Oh, you're gonna regret that, lady. Tank stepped forward, his imposing frame looming over her. His voice was a growl, low and menacing. Think you're tough, huh? We'll see how long that lasts. He swung at her, a wide, clumsy blow meant to overwhelm rather than connect. Morgan ducked easily, her movements smooth and practiced. As she rose, she drove her elbow into his ribs with precision, forcing him to stumble back, clutching his side. His breath hitched, and his face contorted with pain and anger. Come on, all of you, Tank barked, motioning for the others. Take her down. Morgan's pulse remained steady, her focus razor-sharp. Her training had prepared her for moments like this, and she was ready to show them just how wrong they'd been. Morgan's muscles tensed as the men closed in, their movements erratic but charged with aggression. Patchybeard lunged first, his fists raised, swinging wildly. Morgan deflected his strikes with precision, her movements efficient and deliberate. With a sharp kick to his knee, she sent him reeling, his balance faltering just enough for her to shove him backward. He hit the ground with a loud thud, cursing as he struggled to get up. The younger man who had leaned against the tree made his move next, his approach more cautious but no less hostile. He swung at her, but Morgan stepped into his attack, blocking it with her forearm and driving her palm into his chest with force. The impact sent him stumbling back, gasping for air. He glared at her, his face flushed with exertion. You're going to pay for that, he growled, circling her like a wary predator. Morgan didn't respond. Her eyes stayed locked on him, her body poised and ready. The familiar burn of adrenaline coursed through her veins, sharpening her focus. This wasn't just a fight, this was survival. Tank, having recovered, advanced again. His movements were slower now but deliberate. "You think you're some kind of hero?" he spat. "Think you can walk into our park and show us up?" Morgan turned to face him fully, her voice calm but unyielding. "This isn't your park, and I'm not the one showing anyone up. You've done that to yourselves." Her words cut deep, igniting his rage. With a growl, he feinted left and threw a punch aimed at her head. Morgan ducked, countering with a quick strike to his torso and a low kick to his shin. Tank stumbled, barely staying on his feet, and swung again, this time more out of frustration than strategy. Morgan sidestepped effortlessly, forcing him to overextend and lose his balance. "Come on, Tank!" Patchy Beard shouted as he staggered to his feet, his voice tinged with desperation. "Stop playing around." Morgan caught movement from the corner of her eye. One of the younger men had grabbed a tree branch and was swinging it like a bat. She stepped inside his reach, twisting the branch from his grip in one swift motion. A quick shove sent him sprawling backward, tripping over his own feet and landing hard on the gravel path. Tank, enraged, let out a roar and charged at her full force. Morgan let him close the distance, sidestepping at the last second and using his momentum to drive him headfirst into a nearby tree. The impact was solid. Tank staggered, clutching the rough bark for support as he tried to regain his footing. Patchy Beard, emboldened by the momentary distraction, lunged at her from behind. Morgan sensed his presence and spun, catching him mid-charge. She delivered a sharp elbow strike to his chest, followed by a shove that sent him crashing to the ground once more. The fight was relentless, chaos unfolding with every move, but Morgan's precision and training were evident. Every calculated strike reflected years of discipline. Still, she wasn't unscathed. Her ribs throbbed from a poorly blocked punch, and her forearm ached where the tree branch had grazed her. But she pushed the pain aside, her focus unbroken. Tank stumbled back into the clearing, his face twisted in fury. "You think this is over?" he snarled, his voice a volatile mix of anger and desperation. "You're going to regret this, lady. You're gonna regret messing with us." Morgan straightened, her breathing steady despite the effort she'd exerted. Her voice, icy and firm, sliced through the tension. "No," she said coldly. "You're the one who's going to regret it." The remaining men, bruised and battered, exchanged uncertain glances. Patchy Beard rose slowly, his confidence visibly shaken. One of the younger men backed away, muttering under his breath, "This ain't worth it." But Tank wasn't ready to back down. His pride wouldn't let him. "You think you've won," he spat. "You don't know what you've started." Morgan's eyes narrowed. "Then let's finish it," he said. Before anyone could move, a distant sound pierced the charged atmosphere, the faint wail of approaching sirens. The gang's heads snapped toward the noise, their bravado faltering. Anger gave way to unease. "You hear that?" one of the younger men muttered, taking a cautious step back. "Cops are coming." "So what?" Tank barked, his frustration boiling over. "We're not done here." Patchy Beard shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Tank. "Look, man, this ain't worth it." "Shut up," Tank growled, pointing a finger at him. "We don't run. We finish this." Morgan stood her ground, her breathing even despite the ache in her ribs. She could see the fractures forming in their unity, the cracks in the confidence that had fueled their aggression. The balance of power was shifting, and Morgan was prepared for whatever came next. The sirens grew louder, closing in like an unavoidable storm. Their wail promised intervention, a threat that the gang couldn't ignore. "Tank?" one of the younger men said again, his voice sharper now, laced with urgency. "She's not worth it. Let's just go." Tank turned back to Morgan, his fists trembling at his sides, his eyes blazing with a mix of rage and frustration. For a moment it seemed like he might push forward, consequences be damned. His pride demanded it. But the sirens gave another sharp rising howl, and the red and blue flashes of police lights cut through the shadows of the trees. "Damn it!" Tank cursed, his voice cracking with anger. His glare burned into Morgan, venomous and full of spite. "This ain't over." Morgan's voice was cold and steady, each word like steel. "Yes, it is." With a frustrated growl, Tank spun on his heel, motioning sharply for the others to follow. "Let's go. Move," he said. Patchy Beard didn't hesitate, limping after Tank with a grimace. The younger men exchanged one last glance at Morgan, their expressions a mixture of anger and unease. One of them muttered under his breath, "She's crazy," before turning and trailing after their leader. As they disappeared into the tree line, Morgan stayed rooted in place. Her body remained coiled with tension, her ears tracking the fading sound of their retreating footsteps. Her eyes scanned the clearing, sharp and vigilant, making sure none of them doubled back. Only when she was certain they were gone did she allow herself to exhale, her breath slow and deliberate. The sirens were nearly upon her now, the crunch of tires on gravel signaling the arrival of law enforcement. 2 squad cars pulled to a stop at the edge of the clearing, their flashing lights painting the trees in bursts of red and blue. Doors opened and officers stepped out cautiously, their hands resting on their belts as they assessed the scene. One of them, a tall man with an authoritative presence, approached her. His tone was clipped but professional. "Ma'am, are you okay? We got a call about a disturbance in the park." Morgan nodded, keeping her tone even. "I'm fine. They're gone now." The officer's eyes lingered on her for a moment, noting the scrape on her arm and the subtle shift in her stance that betrayed the pain she was masking. "Did they hurt you?" Morgan shook her head. "Nothing I can't handle." Another officer surveyed the area, his eyes catching signs of the scuffle: disturbed dirt, a discarded tree branch, a hat left behind by one of the younger men. He turned to his partner. "Looks like they ran in a hurry." The first officer sighed, pulling out a notepad. "Can you describe them?" Morgan hesitated, her mind replaying the encounter. The adrenaline was beginning to ebb, leaving behind the dull ache of bruises and the sharp sting on her arm. Her voice was measured when she answered. 4 of them. Mid-20s, mostly. The leader, tall, shaved head, tattoos on his neck. Calls himself Tank. The officer nodded, jotting it all down. "Did they say anything? Anything to suggest why they targeted you?" he asked. Morgan's jaw tightened as their words echoed in her mind. The mocking tones, the slurs, the hatred barely disguised as bravado. She chose her words carefully. It wasn't random, they knew what they were doing. The officer's pen hovered mid-air, his brow furrowing. "Meaning?" Morgan met his gaze, her voice steady and resolute. "Meaning they've done this before, and they'll do it again." The officer's expression hardened as he finished scribbling his notes. "We'll keep an eye out for them. In the meantime, we'd like you to come down to the station and file a formal report." Morgan nodded slowly. "I'll meet you there." The officers returned to their vehicles, their radios crackling faintly as they coordinated. Morgan took a moment to steady herself, her breath evening out as she surveyed the now quiet clearing. The tranquility was deceptive. The weight of what had just happened lingered heavily in the air. Tank's parting words weren't just a threat, they were a challenge. And Morgan had no intention of backing down. No. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed faintly overhead as Morgan sat across from Officer Reyes. Her expression was calm, but her body still thrummed with residual adrenaline. Though the physical confrontation in the park was over, the sting of the men's words lingered. Their hateful intent had been unmistakable. As Officer Reyes began typing up her statement, Morgan replayed the encounter in her mind. Not just the fight, the taunts, the sneers, and the pointed reminder of why they had chosen her as their target. She had faced countless enemies in her time, but this was different. This wasn't about power or tactics. It was about something far more insidious. Officer Reyes, a sharp-eyed young man with a no-nonsense demeanor, flipped open his notebook. "Let's start from the beginning, Miss Blake. You mentioned there were 4 men and that their leader called himself Tank. Can you walk me through exactly what happened?" Morgan recounted the events with precise detail. The mocking tone, the hateful comments, the way they encircled her like predators. Her voice was calm but carried a subtle edge, each word painting a vivid picture of the encounter. Reyes' pen moved quickly across the page, his brow furrowing as the story unfolded. When she finished, he tapped the pen against his notebook, a grim expression settling over his face. "This doesn't sound random. Are you certain you've never seen these men before?" he asked. "I'm sure," Morgan replied firmly. "They weren't after my bag. That was just an excuse. They saw me sitting alone and thought they could intimidate me. They wanted me to feel out of place." Reyes leaned back in his chair, his frown deepening. "Why do you think they singled you out?" "Because I'm black," Morgan said without hesitation. Reyes' pen froze mid-air. "They said that?" "Huh?" Morgan's jaw tightened, not directly at first, but it was clear in their words and actions. They made it obvious. Comments about me thinking I'm better than them, that people like me don't belong. This wasn't about stealing something, it was about making me feel small. Reyes exhaled heavily, snapping his notebook shut. We've had reports of harassment like this lately, minor incidents in public spaces. But if this group is targeting people based on race... He trailed off, his frustration evident. They are, Morgan said firmly, and they've been doing it for a while. They were too confident, too comfortable. This wasn't their first time. Reyes leaned forward, his gaze intent. I'll run their descriptions through the system and cross-reference recent reports. But I'll be honest with you, Ms. Blake. Cases like this are hard to pursue. Without charges or solid evidence, it's tough to build a case. Morgan's voice was like steel. Then find the evidence, because I'm not letting this slide. Hours later, Morgan sat in her dimly lit living room, her laptop screen casting a faint glow. Her instincts told her not to sit idle. Her military training demanded action. If Reyes needed proof, she would find it. It didn't take long for patterns to emerge. Over the past 6 months, multiple reports of harassment and minor assaults had cropped up across the area. The victims were always people of color. Morgan's jaw tightened as she read through the accounts. The descriptions were consistent. A tall, broad-shouldered man with tattoos on his neck, flanked by younger men. Tank. In many cases, the victims hadn't pressed charges, likely deterred by fear or frustration with the system, but their accounts echoed the same sentiment. These attacks weren't about theft, they were about sending a message. Digging deeper, Morgan stumbled upon a local community forum where similar incidents were being discussed. One thread stood out. These guys aren't just random thugs. They target minorities. They pick their spots, intimidate people, and get out fast. Nobody ever catches them. Her phone buzzed, breaking her concentration. It was a message from Sarah Carter, her best friend and a journalist with a reputation for chasing stories others avoided. Heard about what happened. You okay? Call me. Morgan didn't hesitate. She hit the call button and Sarah picked up almost instantly. Morgan, I saw the news. Are you all right? Sarah asked, her voice laced with concern. Morgan explained everything, the attack, the hateful remarks, and the patterns she had uncovered. There was a pause on the other end before Sarah spoke, her tone grim. This doesn't sound like a random group of punks. If they're this organized in targeting minorities, this could be a hate group. That's exactly what it is, Morgan said, and I'm not letting them get away with it. Sarah sighed. I get it, but these people are dangerous, Morgan. If you dig too deep... They came after me because they thought I'd back down, Morgan interrupted. They thought I'd just let it happen. They were wrong. There was a moment of silence before Sarah responded, her voice resigned but resolute. What do you need? Anything you can find, Morgan replied. Where they hang out, how long they've been doing this, why the police haven't stopped them, anything. Sarah hesitated. I'll see what I can do, but promise me you'll be careful. People like this don't take kindly to being exposed. Morgan's gaze was steady as she stared at her laptop screen, Tank's face etched into her memory. I'll be careful, she said finally. But this ends. Morgan ended the call with a sharp exhale, her resolve hardening. These men had made a grave mistake targeting her, thinking she would cower. The pain from the fight only fueled her determination, and as she leaned back in her chair, she silently vowed to expose them. The next morning, the soft hum of her neighborhood waking up provided an odd juxtaposition to the grim reality Morgan was uncovering. Children played outside, dogs barked in the distance, and the faint buzz of a lawnmower drifted through the window. At her dining table, Morgan sat with a steaming cup of black coffee, her laptop glowing with the evidence Sarah had sent overnight. The files were damning. Sarah had unearthed a trove of information about Tank and his crew, painting a picture of a coordinated operation. This wasn't just a group of thugs looking for trouble, it was a loosely organized network with calculated methods of intimidation. Assaults, vandalism, and targeted harassment. They weren't random acts, but a deliberate campaign to instill fear in minority communities. Morgan's fingers hovered over a particularly chilling note, rumors of someone pulling the strings above Tank, a leader. The idea both angered and motivated her. Her phone buzzed, breaking her concentration. It was Officer Reyes. Blake, she answered, her tone clipped. Morning, Reyes said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. I've been digging into the names you gave me. You were right. Tank's not just some random punk. He's tied to a bunch of reported incidents, and his group's been stirring trouble for months." "I could have told you that," Morgan replied curtly. "What's the plan to stop them?" Reyes hesitated. "That's the issue. Most of the victims didn't press charges, so there's no paper trail. Legally, it's hard to connect the dots." "Then make a trail," Morgan snapped. "If I can find this much on my own, you have the resources to dig deeper. Don't tell me your hands are tied." Reyes sighed audibly. "Look, I want to nail these guys as much as you do, but if we don't build a solid case, anything we do could fall apart in court. If they walk, it's over." Morgan's frustration mounted. "So what are you saying? We sit on our hands while they terrorize people?" "There's a rumor," Reyes admitted reluctantly. "Tank's group might be connected to a bigger network. We're talking hate crimes, possibly even domestic terrorism. If that's true, the feds could step in. But we need concrete evidence to escalate this." Morgan's jaw tightened. "Then you'd better be ready when I bring you something. Blake, don't do anything reckless." She hung up before he could finish. That evening, Morgan sat across from Sarah in a small, dimly lit coffee shop on the other side of town. The journalist looked weary but driven, her laptop open beside her. She slid a thick folder across the table, her expression grave. "This is bigger than we thought," Sarah said. "Tank's gang is just one piece of the puzzle. There are at least 3 other groups operating in the region. Different names, different methods, but the same goal: intimidation." Morgan flipped through the folder, her frown deepening. Photos of hateful graffiti, mugshots of gang members, maps dotted with red circles marking incidents. It was a chilling, calculated effort to push fear into specific communities. "They're trying to drive people out," Morgan muttered, her voice low. "Make them feel unsafe in their own neighborhoods." The man looked up. "Exactly," Sarah said, "and they've been flying under the radar. Each incident is too small to draw national attention, and nobody's connecting the dots, until now." Morgan's mind churned, piecing together the information. This wasn't just a group of angry men with too much time on their hands. This was a coordinated operation. If they could identify the leader above Tank, they might dismantle the entire network. "What about funding?" Morgan asked. "No way this is just a hobby. Someone's backing them." Sarah nodded, her expression grim. "That's the tricky part. There are whispers about private donations, maybe even ties to fringe organizations, but nothing concrete yet." Morgan closed the folder, her expression resolute. "Then we need to find that connection, because whoever's funding them, that's who we take down." Sarah leaned back, studying Morgan with a mixture of admiration and concern. "You're going to see this through, aren't you?" Morgan's eyes burned with determination. "I have to. They picked the wrong person to mess with." Morgan leaned back, her arms crossed. "Then we go after Tank first. He's the weak link. If we can turn him, he might lead us to whoever's running this." Sarah looked hesitant. "That's risky. You know he's not going to just roll over." Morgan's expression hardened. "Then we'll make him. If Rails won't push hard enough, I will." Sarah opened her mouth to protest, but Morgan held up a hand. "I know what I'm doing. I didn't survive everything I've been through just to let men like him win. This ends now." Sarah sighed, her expression softening. "Just promise me you'll be careful." Morgan's gaze didn't waver. "Careful doesn't win wars." As she left the coffee shop, Morgan's mind was set. Tank had slipped through her fingers once, but she wouldn't let it happen again. He was the key to unraveling this entire operation, and she was going to bring him down no matter what it took. Morgan moved through the shadows of the city like a ghost, her presence unnoticed by the world around her. The soft hum of distant traffic provided a steady backdrop as she approached the rundown bar Sarah had flagged in her research. Tank and his crew had been known to frequent this place, a seedy, dimly lit dive on the edge of town where the air was thick with cigarette smoke and bad intentions. She stopped just short of the entrance, blending into the shadows as she scoped out the area. 2 men stood near the door, chatting idly, their voices low but their body language defensive. They weren't dressed like Tank's crew, but Morgan knew better than to trust appearances. She adjusted her cap, pulling it lower over her face, and slipped inside without drawing their attention. The bar was a dark, claustrophobic space, the kind of place where people went to disappear. Morgan's eyes adjusted quickly, scanning the room for familiar faces. She spotted Patchybeard almost immediately, sitting in a booth with one of the younger men from the park. They were hunched over their drinks, their conversation animated. Neither of them noticed her as she moved toward the bar. The bartender, a wiry man with a face like weathered leather, glanced up as she approached. "What'll it be?" "Information," Morgan said quietly, sliding a 20 across the counter. "I'm looking for someone. Big guy, shaved head, tattoos on his neck, goes by Tank." The bartender's expression didn't change, but his eyes flicked toward the booth where Patchy Beard sat. "Never heard of him." Morgan slid another bill across the counter. "You sure?" He hesitated, glancing toward the booth again before leaning in. "They were here earlier, left in a hurry when word got around the cops were looking for them. Heard him mention something about the warehouse on Fletcher Street, that's all I know." Morgan nodded, slipping him one more bill for good measure. "Thanks." She left the bar as quietly as she'd entered, her mind already working through the possibilities. Fletcher Street was in the industrial part of town, a maze of abandoned warehouses and forgotten factories. If Tank was hiding out there, it wouldn't be easy to find him, but it also meant he was running out of options. An hour later, Morgan crouched behind a stack of rusted shipping containers, her eyes fixed on a dimly lit warehouse. The place was quiet, but she could see movement through the broken windows, shadows shifting against the faint glow of a single overhead light. Her instincts told her she'd found the right spot. Tank's crew wasn't big enough to maintain full security, but she knew better than to expect an unguarded hideout. She scanned the area, her SEAL training guiding her assessment of potential entry points and threats. 2 figures stood near the main entrance, their postures tense. One of them was smoking, the orange glow of the cigarette briefly illuminating his face. Morgan recognized him as one of the younger men from the park. The other was unfamiliar, but his build suggested he wasn't someone to take lightly. Morgan's breath was steady as she formulated her plan. She needed to get inside without drawing attention, but she also needed leverage. If Tank was here, he wouldn't give up anything willingly, not without a reason. Slipping around the side of the warehouse, Morgan found a broken window partially hidden by overgrown bushes. She tested the frame carefully, wincing as it creaked faintly under her touch. Sliding inside, she landed silently on the concrete floor, crouching low as she surveyed the space. The warehouse was as dilapidated as she expected, its walls streaked with grime and its air heavy with the smell of oil and decay. Morgan crept closer, her steps silent as she moved toward the faint murmur of voices. Tank's unmistakable growl cut through the hushed conversation. "I told you, we lay low until this blows over. No more park jobs, not until I say so." Patchy Beard's voice was quieter, tinged with frustration. "You're acting like we can just sit on our hands. People are asking questions." "Let them ask," Tank snapped. "We don't move until I say so. End of discussion." From her vantage point behind a stack of crates, Morgan could see Tank standing near a makeshift table, his large frame lit by the weak overhead light. Patchy Beard and another man sat nearby, their postures tense. In the shadows, a few others lingered, their faces indistinct, but their presence unmistakable. Morgan assessed the situation carefully. She needed a way to draw Tank out without putting herself in immediate danger. Reaching into her pocket, she pulled out her phone and quickly typed a message to Sarah. "Found him. Warehouse on Fletcher. Call Race now." As she hit send, Morgan adjusted her stance, mentally preparing for the next move. She wasn't leaving without answers, but she also wasn't reckless enough to take on Tank and his crew alone. The sirens had bought her time at the park, but this time she needed more than luck to tip the scales. "Tank," Morgan's voice cut through the tense silence. The room froze. Every head turned toward her. Tank's eyes narrowed as he stepped forward, his expression darkening with recognition. "You," he growled. Morgan straightened, her expression calm and her gaze sharp. "We're going to have a conversation." Tank laughed, a low menacing sound. "You think you can just walk in here and start making demands?" Her tone was cold, unrelenting. "I think you're going to tell me everything I want to know because if you don't, this place will be swarming with cops in less than 5 minutes. Tank's smirk faltered for a moment before he recovered. "You don't scare me." "You should be." The uneasy glances exchanged among Tank's crew didn't escape Morgan's notice. Their earlier bravado was fading fast as her calm, unyielding presence filled the room. Her voice, sharp and cutting, carried authority none of them could ignore. "You've got guts," Tank said, his voice strained as he tried to maintain his composure. "But guts don't mean much when you're outnumbered." Morgan's sharp gaze swept the room, quickly counting the men, 5 including Tank. Her expression didn't waver. Outnumbered. I've seen worse odds, and guess what? They didn't win either. Tank's fists clenched at his sides. Big talk. You think you're some kind of hero? No, Morgan replied coldly. I'm just the one who's going to make sure you answer for what you've done. Before Tank could respond, the faint wail of police sirens reached the warehouse. The sound grew louder, the flashing blue and red lights casting jagged shadows across the grimy walls. Tank froze, his smirk slipping into an expression of genuine alarm. You called the cops? Patchybeard spat, his voice rising in panic. He looked toward the exit, his instincts screaming for him to run. You think I came here without a plan? Morgan's voice was steel. It's over. Don't let her scare you, Tank barked, his voice cracking under the weight of his own uncertainty. We've handled worse than this. Have you? Morgan asked, stepping forward. Because from where I'm standing you're about to lose everything. Outside, the sound of tires crunching gravel was followed by the slamming of car doors and the muffled voices of officers closing in. Tank's crew shifted uneasily, their earlier confidence dissolving as they looked to their leader for direction. Even Tank seemed momentarily at a loss. Tank, what do we do? One of the younger men whispered urgently. Shut up and stay put, Tank snapped, his frustration spilling over. We're not running. Morgan's voice cut through the rising chaos. You don't have to run, but you will face the consequences. Patchybeard's nerve finally broke, and he bolted toward the back exit. Morgan moved like a flash, intercepting him before he could escape. Grabbing his arm, she twisted it behind his back with practiced precision, forcing him to his knees. He yelped, his bravado crumbling into panicked cries. You're not going anywhere, Morgan said evenly, her grip unyielding. Tank and the others stared, their hesitation giving the officers outside just enough time to act. The front doors burst open and a team of uniformed police officers stormed in, weapons drawn but voices commanding. Police, hands in the air, one officer barked. Tank's face twisted in rage, but he raised his hands reluctantly. The younger men followed suit, their fear outweighing any lingering loyalty to their leader. Within moments, the officers moved swiftly, restraining the group and placing them in handcuffs. Morgan released Patchybeard, stepping back as an officer took over. Straightening, her sharp gaze remained locked on Tank as he was cuffed and hauled to his feet. You think this changes anything? Tank snarled at her, his voice brimming with venom. You think you've stopped us? Morgan stepped closer, her voice low enough that only he could hear. You're done. The people you've hurt, the fear you've spread, it ends here. And if there's anyone above you, I'll find them too. The little man screamed again and staggered backwards, hands flailing in the air. Tank glared at her, his bravado crumbling into a hollow shell. The officers led him and his crew out of the warehouse, their voices fading as the group was escorted to waiting squad cars. Officer Reyes approached Morgan, his expression a mix of relief and respect. You weren't kidding when you said you'd bring us something concrete. Morgan crossed her arms, her posture unwavering. You've got them now, don't let them slip through the cracks. Reyes nodded. We'll make sure they don't. You've done more than your part here, Blake. Morgan didn't respond immediately, her eyes lingering on the warehouse. The echoes of the confrontation still buzzed in her mind. Finally she said, This isn't over. Tank's just a piece of the puzzle. There's someone bigger pulling the strings, and I'm going to find them. Reyes frowned. We'll do what we can. But don't go after them alone. You've already done enough. Morgan gave him a small, cold smile. We both know I don't stop halfway. As the officers finished clearing the scene, Morgan turned and walked away, the faint chill of the night air brushing against her face. Tank and his crew were in custody, but the battle wasn't over. This was just the beginning, and she was ready for whatever came next. Dim light of Morgan's laptop screen flickered across her face as she leaned forward, her fingers tapping quickly on the keyboard. It was well past midnight, but the adrenaline from Tank's capture still coursed through her veins. The warehouse bust had been a solid win, but it was only one part of a larger puzzle. Tank's operations weren't isolated, they were part of something bigger, and she needed to know who was pulling the strings. Across from her, Sarah sat cross-legged on the couch, scrolling through a series of documents on her tablet. Her usual sharp wit was dulled by exhaustion. but the determination in her eyes mirrored Morgan's. Reyes confirmed they're keeping Tank in holding for now, Sarah said, her voice low but steady. But if they don't get something concrete to charge him with, he'll lawyer up and walk. He's not walking, Morgan replied firmly, not if we can prove he's tied to the larger network. Sarah frowned, her fingers pausing mid-screen. It's not going to be easy. These groups are careful. They keep their operations decentralized so no one person has all the answers. That's why we focus on Tank, Morgan said. He knows more than he's letting on. We just need to make him talk. Sarah hesitated, her brows furrowing. And if he doesn't? Morgan leaned back, exhaling slowly. Then we find another way. Someone else in his crew knows something. Patchy Beard, one of the younger guys. They're followers, not leaders. They'll crack before he does. The next morning, Morgan met Reyes at the police station. The atmosphere was tense, a faint buzz of ringing phones and murmured conversations filling the air. Reyes led her down a quiet hallway to the interrogation rooms. Tank's in there, Reyes said, nodding toward a door with a small observation window. He hasn't said much since last night. Just a lot of posturing. Morgan folded her arms. Let me talk to him. Reyes hesitated, his expression skeptical. You sure? He's the type who'll try to get under your skin. Morgan's gaze didn't waver. He can try, it won't work. Reyes opened the door and Morgan stepped inside. Tank sat at the metal table, his broad shoulders hunched as he leaned back in the chair. His wrists were cuffed, but his expression radiated defiance. As she entered, a smirk curled his lips. Well, if it isn't Wonder Woman, he drawled. What, they send you in here to finish what you started? Morgan pulled out the chair across from Tank and sat down, her posture relaxed, but her eyes sharp. You're in a lot of trouble, Tank. He laughed, the sound hollow and forced. Trouble, lady? This is just a hiccup. I'll be out of here before you finish your coffee. Not this time, Morgan said, her voice low and steady. Your crew's already folding. Patchy Beard? He's singing like a bird. The younger guys? They're terrified. It's only a matter of time before they give us everything we need. Tank's smirk faltered just for a second before he leaned forward. You're bluffing. Try me, Morgan shot back, holding his gaze. You think you're the only one who's good at reading people? You're not as untouchable as you think. Tank's jaw tightened, the bravado slipping further. Morgan pressed on. We already know about the other groups, the other crews operating in the area. We know you're connected to something bigger. But you're small time. The guy above you, he doesn't care about you. The second you're a liability, you're gone. Tank's fists clenched, frustration boiling over. You don't know what you're talking about. Morgan leaned in, her voice quiet but cutting. Don't I? If you're smart, you'll start talking, because the people you're protecting, they won't protect you. The door opened and Reyes stepped in, holding a folder. He set it on the table, flipping it open to reveal photos and reports tied to Tank's crew. He slid one of the photos across the table, a surveillance image of Tank with a man Morgan didn't recognize. That's your boss, isn't it? Morgan said, nodding toward the photo. The one pulling the strings? What's his name? Tank stared at the photo, his jaw working as he fought to maintain his composure. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, until finally he slumped back in his chair. You don't get it, he muttered, his voice bitter. Even if I told you, it wouldn't matter. He's untouchable. Morgan's eyes narrowed. Let us worry about that. Tank hesitated, his gaze flicking between Morgan and Reyes. For the first time, the cracks in his facade were fully visible. His name's Paul Hendrick. He's the one running things. Morgan exchanged a glance with Reyes, her expression hardening. They had a name, but it wasn't over yet. Later, as Morgan and Sarah reconvened at the coffee shop, the weight of the name Tank had given them hung between them. Sarah's fingers flew across her laptop keyboard, pulling up information on Paul Hendrick. He's a businessman, Sarah said, her tone incredulous. Runs a few construction companies. On the surface, it all looks clean. Morgan frowned, leaning over the screen. And underneath? Not so clean, Sarah replied. A few shell companies, ties to fringe political groups. It's subtle, but it's there. Morgan's mind raced. Hendrick was the link they needed, but he wouldn't go down easily. She glanced at Sarah, her expression resolute. Then we make him answer for it. Morgan sat in the bustling precinct conference room. its sterile walls now covered in printouts, photos, and maps connected by bright red strings pinned across a corkboard. Paul Hendrick's name sat at the center of it all, circled in thick black marker. Officers shuffled around the room, reviewing files and comparing notes, but Morgan's focus was on Reyes, who stood by the board briefing a small team. "This is where it gets tricky," Reyes said, pointing to a cluster of pins marking Hendrick's businesses. "On paper, the man's spotless. All his operations are legit, at least as far as we can tell. But thanks to Tank's testimony and Morgan's intel, we've got enough to suspect he's using his construction companies as a front to fund and coordinate these hate groups." Sarah, seated at the corner of the table with her laptop, raised a hand. "I found some unusual financial activity tied to Hendrick, shell companies moving money around, donations to political organizations with extremist ties. It's subtle, but it's there." Reyes nodded, his jaw tightening. "Subtle isn't enough for a warrant, though. We need something concrete. Bank statements, communications, anything that ties Hendrick directly to these groups." Morgan crossed her arms, her expression grim. "What about the crew we picked up? Tank gave us Hendrick's name. Patchybeard and the others must know something." "They're scared," Reyes admitted. "The idea of flipping on Hendrick has them rattled. They know how dangerous he is." Morgan stepped forward, her tone firm. "Then we push harder. Hendrick isn't going to stop. If we don't act, more people will get hurt." Morgan sat across from Patchybeard in the sterile interrogation room. The bravado he'd shown at the park was gone, replaced by a nervous energy that made him shift constantly in his seat. His eyes darted to the mirrored wall, then back to Morgan. "You don't get it," he muttered, his voice shaky. "Paul's got connections, big ones. If he finds out I talked, he'll—" "What?" Morgan interrupted, her voice calm but unyielding. "You're already in custody. Do you think he's going to stick his neck out for you? Men like Hendrick don't protect people like you, they use you." Patchybeard fidgeted with his hands on the table, his discomfort palpable. I didn't think it'd go this far. The park stuff, the harassment, it was just supposed to scare people. But Paul's always had bigger plans." Morgan leaned in, her eyes narrowing. "What plans?" Helen ticked. He hesitated, the weight of his decision clear in his expression. Finally, he exhaled heavily. "He's using us to stir up chaos. Fear makes people easy to control, you know. Paul's got ties to groups that want to push laws, policies, stuff that benefits them. We're just the boots on the ground." Morgan's stomach churned, but she kept her face neutral. And the funding? How does it work?" "Launders it through the construction companies," Patchybeard admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sends the money to shell accounts, then it gets funneled to the crews. We get our cut for doing the dirty work." Reyes, who had been watching from behind the glass, stepped into the room holding a file. "That's enough to start connecting the dots," he said, setting the folder on the table. "But we'll need you to testify." Patchybeard froze, his eyes wide with panic. "Testify? Are you crazy? Paul will have me killed." "Not if we take him down first," Morgan said firmly. "Help us and we'll make sure you're protected." Later, back in the precinct's conference room, Morgan and Reyes reviewed the new intel with Sarah. The financial trail Patchybeard had described matched Sarah's earlier findings, creating a clearer picture of Hendrick's operations. "This is the break we needed," Sarah said, scrolling through files on her laptop. "We can tie the money directly to Tank's crew and a few other groups operating in neighboring counties. With the paper trail and Tank's testimony, it's enough to get a search warrant." Reyes nodded, his expression resolute. "I'll get the paperwork filed. Once we have the warrant, we'll raid Hendrick's main office." Morgan's jaw tightened. "This isn't just about arresting him. We need to dismantle everything. His network, his funding, his influence. Otherwise, someone else will just take his place." Sarah placed a reassuring hand on Morgan's arm. "One step at a time. Taking Hendrick down is the first step." The warrant was approved faster than anyone anticipated. By evening, Morgan stood with Reyes and a team of officers outside Hendrick's sleek office building. Its gleaming glass facade was a stark contrast to the corruption hidden within. The team moved quickly, securing the premises with practiced precision. Inside, officers rifled through files, computers, and desk drawers. Sarah had joined as an observer, snapping photos and taking notes for the eventual exposé. Reyes emerged from one of the offices with a thick binder in hand, his expression triumphant. "This is it," he said, holding up the binder. Transaction records, emails, it's all here. Hendricks done. Morgan allowed herself a small, satisfied smile, but she knew the fight wasn't over. Hendricks' arrest was only the beginning of dismantling the network he had built. Later that night, Morgan sat in the precinct's dimly lit conference room, a map of the city spread across the table. Red and blue pins marked locations tied to incidents over the past year. Parks, alleys, and small businesses, all clustered in neighborhoods targeted by Tank's crew and similar groups. Across from her, Reyes shuffled through a stack of files, his brow furrowed. "This is bigger than we thought," Reyes said, sliding one of the files toward Morgan. "Hendricks' name pops up in connection with several of these incidents, but it's always indirect. Donations to questionable organizations. Funding for businesses that suddenly went under after trouble started in their neighborhoods. He's careful. Keeps himself insulated." Morgan leaned over the map, her eyes narrowing as she traced the connections. Careful isn't untouchable. He's left a trail. It's just a matter of pulling it together. Sarah entered the room, a laptop under her arm and a determined look in her eyes. "I've been digging into Hendricks' financials," she said, setting the laptop on the table and spinning it toward them. "He's got money moving through a series of shell companies. On paper, it looks legitimate. Construction, consulting, community development. But the timing lines up with the start of these incidents. He's funneling funds to these groups under the guise of donations." Morgan's resolve hardened. "Then we've got him." Reyes frowned as he flipped through the stack of documents. "If we can prove the money's being used to finance hate groups, that's a federal case. But we need more than circumstantial evidence." Morgan leaned back, her mind racing. "Then we go after his people. Tank might not know much beyond his orders, but someone in Hendricks' circle does. He's not doing this alone." Sarah nodded, her fingers flying across her keyboard. "If we can find out who's handling the logistics, fund transfers, meeting locations, that might give us what we need." Later that evening, Morgan and Reyes sat in an unmarked car outside a nondescript office building downtown. The harsh glow of fluorescent lights spilled onto the sidewalk, casting long shadows across the otherwise empty street. According to Sarah's intel, this building served as a potential hub for Hendricks' operations, a front for his network. "We're not going in without backup," Reyes said, his tone firm. Morgan's eyes stayed on the building. "We're not going in at all, not yet. We watch, we gather intel, and we follow anyone who looks important." Reyes glanced at her, skeptical. "You really think someone's going to lead us straight to Hendrick?" "They always do," Morgan replied, her voice steady. "Everyone makes a mistake eventually." Hours passed in tense silence, their patience finally rewarded when a sleek black SUV pulled up to the entrance. A well-dressed man in his 40s stepped out, glancing around nervously before heading inside. Morgan's eyes narrowed. "That's Thomas Kane," she said, recognizing him from one of Sarah's reports. "He's one of Hendricks' top guys, handles the financials." Reyes reached for his radio. "We tail him when he leaves. If he's meeting Hendrick, we'll know soon enough." The tailing operation led them to an upscale restaurant on the other side of town. From their position across the street, Morgan and Reyes watched as Kane entered and was greeted warmly by a man in a tailored suit, Paul Hendrick himself. The two men were seated at a private table near the back, their conversation hidden behind thick glass and a curtain of privacy. "This is it," Morgan murmured. "We've got him," Reyes nodded, already coordinating surveillance through his radio. "We get audio and visual. If they discuss anything incriminating, we'll have it." Hours later, back at the precinct, the recordings from the restaurant played on a monitor. Hendricks' voice was calm and measured, but the content of his words was damning. "We need to keep the pressure up in those neighborhoods," Hendricks said, his tone cold. "If they feel unsafe, they'll leave, and once they're gone, we move in. Keep property, big profits." Kane responded, his voice quieter but no less incriminating. "What about the crews? They're getting reckless." Hendricks' tone sharpened. "Then we replace them. These are tools, nothing more. As long as they get the job done, I don't care what happens to them." The room was silent as the recording ended. Reyes turned to Morgan, his expression grim. "That's enough to bring him in." Morgan's gaze remained fixed on the monitor. "It's enough to end this." She stood in the center of the precinct's operations room, her arms crossed as Reyes and Sarah spread out the documents and photos they'd gathered. Paul Hendricks' name loomed over them like a dark cloud. Reyes had pulled Hendricks' files overnight, and the picture they painted was troubling. A respected businessman on the surface, but with undeniable ties to extremist groups. "We've got a lot of circumstantial evidence," Reyes said, gesturing to the photos on the table. "Connections to fringe groups, suspicious payments moving through his shell companies, but nothing solid enough to take him down. He's careful." Sarah nodded. "Everything about his public image screams respectability. Charitable donations, community projects, clean records. But these payments? They're too clean. Almost like someone went out of their way to cover something up." Morgan leaned forward, scanning the documents. Her finger traced a line on one of the financial reports. "These payments, they're too consistent. Same amount, same intervals. That's not charity, that's funding." Sarah nodded, her eyes narrowing. "And guess where they're going? Small organizations with vague descriptions, community initiatives, local improvement groups, all dead ends." Sarah told Tom that she needed to talk to medical professionals about her depression. "But not for us," Morgan said, her voice firm. "We've already connected him to Tank's crew. If we dig deep enough, we'll find the link to the other gangs." Reyes sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "We're going to need more than suspicious payments and hearsay. We need testimony, evidence that directly ties him to these hate crimes." Morgan's jaw tightened. "Then we lean on Tank. He's already cracked once. If we push him, he'll give us more." Reyes shook his head. "Tank's scared, but he's also loyal. He won't go down without a fight." "Loyalty only goes so far," Morgan said. "He knows Hendrik won't protect him. He's a liability now." The interrogation room felt colder than before, the hum of the overhead light filling the silence as Morgan and Reyes faced Tank again. He looked more tired this time, the weight of his situation settling heavily on his broad shoulders. The defiance in his eyes had dimmed, replaced by wary calculation. Morgan placed a file on the table and slid it toward him. Inside were the same photos and reports Reyes had shown her earlier, but this time a new page sat on top, an arrest report for one of Tank's younger crew members. "Your boy rolled over," Morgan said, her voice even. "He gave us everything we needed to connect you to Hendrik." Tank's lips pressed into a thin line, his fists clenching on the table. "He's lying." Morgan didn't flinch. "You sure about that? Because if you're the last one standing, you're the one taking the fall. Hendrik isn't coming for you. You know that." Reyes leaned forward, his tone softer but no less firm. "Help us build the case against Hendrik and you'll still have a chance. You don't, and you're looking at a laundry list of charges that'll bury you." Tank's jaw worked, the muscles twitching as he struggled with the decision. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, until finally he exhaled sharply. "All right," he muttered. "What do you want to know?" Morgan's eyes sharpened. "Everything. How he funds you, how he communicates, the other crews he's tied to. You talk or you go down alone." Schwartz's Tank nodded reluctantly, his voice low. "It's all through his businesses. Construction companies, mostly. He launders the money through contracts, pays us through fronts. We're supposed to keep it quiet, but sometimes things get messy." Morgan's gaze didn't waver. "The other groups?" Tank hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, there's a few. Same setup. We don't work together directly, but we all know the deal. Keep people scared. Keep them out of his neighborhoods." Reyes scribbled notes furiously, his pen scratching against the paper. Morgan didn't break eye contact with Tank. "How does he communicate with you?" "Through middlemen," Tank said. "Guys who handle the money and pass along instructions. I've met Hendrik maybe twice. He doesn't like to get his hands dirty." "Names," Morgan pressed. "We need names." Tank rattled off a list of names and locations, each one more damning than the last. By the time he finished, Reyes looked up, his face grim but determined. "This is enough to start," Reyes said. "We'll cross-check everything. If it holds up, we've got him." Tank slumped back in his chair, the fight drained from him. "You think this is over? Hendrik has people everywhere, you won't touch him." Morgan stood, her expression cold. "Watch me." Back in the operations room, Morgan and Sarah reviewed the information Tank had provided. The names of Hendrik's middlemen gave them a clear trail to follow, and Reyes had already dispatched teams to track them down. The net was tightening, and Hendrik's untouchable image was beginning to crack. "This is it," Sarah said, her voice tinged with both exhaustion and determination. "We're finally getting somewhere." Morgan nodded, her focus unwavering. He's not invincible, he's just been playing the system, and now we're going to take it apart. Morgan sat in the crowded conference room at the precinct, the air heavy with a mix of exhaustion and determination. The table was cluttered with files, photos, and notes, all pointing to one name: Paul Hendrick. The mountain of evidence Reyes's team had collected over the past week painted a damning picture, but Morgan knew the hard part was just beginning. Reyes stood at the front of the room, addressing a team of officers, prosecutors, and investigators. Hendrick's operation has been carefully built to avoid detection, but we've finally got enough to make our case. Thanks to Tank's cooperation, we have names, payment trails, and testimony linking him to multiple hate groups operating in the area. The prosecutor, Simmons, a sharp-eyed woman with a reputation for precision, flipped through the files on the table. We need to make sure this sticks. Hendrick is well connected and his lawyers are going to argue that none of this ties him directly to the crimes. Tank's testimony is our linchpin, Reyes replied. He can put Hendrick in the room and link him to the payments funding these groups. That's assuming he doesn't fold on the stand, Simmons countered skeptically. We've all seen it happen before. The defense will tear him apart if they sense weakness. Morgan, seated at the edge of the table, leaned forward, her voice steady but firm. Tank knows what's at stake. He's scared, and rightfully so, but he also knows Hendrick left him to rot. That betrayal is enough to keep him talking. Simmons nodded, though her expression remained cautious. Even so, we need more than his word. We need to show the jury a clear, undeniable connection between Hendrick and these crimes. Sarah, sitting beside Morgan with her laptop open, chimed in. We've got financial records that show money flowing from Hendrick's companies to shell accounts tied to Tank's crew and others like them. Those accounts are directly linked to payments for materials used in their operations, flyers, graffiti supplies, even weapons in some cases. Morgan added, and the communication logs. Tank's crew used burners, but some of those numbers connect to Hendrick's known associates. It's a pattern, one Hendrick can't explain away. Reyes nodded, his tone firm. This isn't just a hate crime case. It's about dismantling an entire network of intimidation and violence. If we do this right, we send a message that this kind of operation won't go unnoticed or unpunished. The following days blurred into a whirlwind of preparation. Morgan worked tirelessly alongside the team, piecing together the timeline of Hendrick's activities. The deeper they dug, the more it became clear that Hendrick wasn't just a financier. He was the mastermind behind a sprawling operation that had terrorized communities for years. Sarah spent hours digging into Hendrick's public image, uncovering speeches and interviews that subtly hinted at his beliefs. He's careful, she said, scrolling through a video of Hendrick addressing a business convention. He never says anything outright, but he uses phrases that dog whistle to the groups he's funding. Words like preserving community integrity or restoring tradition. It's coded language. That's not enough to convict, Simmons pointed out during a late-night meeting, but it's enough to show intent when combined with everything else. Morgan's focus was unwavering as the team rehearsed every angle of the case. Tank's testimony would be central, but the financial records, intercepted communications, and the paper trail leading straight to Hendrick's desk would solidify their argument. The evidence was overwhelming, but Morgan knew Hendrick's defense team would attack every crack they could find. On the eve of the trial, Morgan found herself alone in the precinct, staring at a whiteboard covered in photos and notes. Hendrick's face stared back at her, his smug expression a reminder of the power he had wielded for so long. She thought about the victims, the people Tank's crew had terrorized, the neighborhoods Hendrick had tried to control through fear. This case wasn't just about justice for her, it was about justice for all of them. Reyes entered the room, breaking her thoughts. You've done a lot to get us here, Blake. I hope you know that. Morgan didn't turn from the board. It's not enough until he's behind bars. Reyes leaned against the doorframe. The prosecution is ready. Sarah's work on the financials sealed a lot of gaps. And Tank? It's scared, Morgan admitted, but he knows this is his only shot at saving himself. Do you think it'll be enough? She asked, finally turning to face him. Reyes's expression was resolute. It has to be. The courtroom was packed the next day as the trial began, the air thick with anticipation. Hendrick sat at the defense table, his expensive suit and calm demeanor projecting confidence, but Morgan could see the tension in his clenched jaw. the way his eyes darted toward his lawyers as the prosecutor began presenting their case. Tang's testimony was a turning point. Though he was visibly nervous, his words were clear and damning. He detailed the payments, the orders, and the unspoken understanding that Hendrik was the man at the top. The defense attempted to discredit him, pointing to his criminal record and his plea deal, but the prosecution countered with the mountain of evidence that corroborated his story. By the end of the first day, it was clear that the prosecution had built a strong case, but Morgan knew the fight wasn't over. The courtroom was tense, the kind of silence that made every shuffle of paper and quiet breath feel amplified. She sat near the back, her arms crossed tightly, watching the final day of the trial unfold. Beside her, Sarah balanced a legal pad on her lap, though her pen hadn't moved in minutes. All attention was fixed on the defense as Hendrik's high-powered attorney made his closing arguments. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the defense attorney began, his voice smooth and confident, "my client is a respected businessman, a pillar of this community. The prosecution wants you to believe he masterminded a network of criminal activity based on nothing more than the word of a desperate man trying to save himself." He gestured toward Tank, who sat hunched at the witness table, avoiding eye contact. "This is the kind of man you're trusting to build a case against Paul Hendrik? A man who's been arrested for numerous crimes? Who only cooperated with the police to save his own skin? Is that the kind of testimony you'd stake your verdict on?" Morgan's jaw tightened as the attorney continued, his words dissecting every minor inconsistency in the prosecution's case with surgical precision. He was good. Too good. She stole a glance at Sarah, who was now struggling furiously on her pad, her frustration evident in the sharp movements of her pen. Finally, the defense rested. The courtroom fell silent as the prosecutor, Simmons, rose to give her rebuttal. Her voice rang clear and precise as she stepped to the center of the courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, the defense would have you believe that Paul Hendrik is nothing more than an innocent businessman caught up in a web of misunderstandings. But the evidence we've presented tells a different story." She turned to the jury, her gaze steady and unwavering. "We've shown you financial records tying Hendrik's companies to the funding of hate groups. We've shown you communication logs connecting his associates to the planning and execution of violent acts. And we've heard testimony from someone who operated within this network, someone who had everything to lose by coming forward." Simmons paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "Hate doesn't always wear a mask, and it doesn't always carry a weapon. Sometimes it hides behind a suit and a polished smile. But make no mistake, Paul Hendrik orchestrated this network of fear and intimidation. Today you have the power to hold him accountable." With that, Simmons returned to her seat, her composure unshaken as the judge dismissed the jury to deliberate. The waiting was unbearable. Hours dragged on as Morgan paced the courthouse lobby, her mind replaying every piece of evidence and every moment of the trial. Sarah leaned against the wall, her arms crossed, watching Morgan with concern. "You've done everything you could," Sarah said quietly. "It's out of your hands now." Morgan didn't respond. She knew Sarah was right, but it didn't make the waiting any easier. Finally, a court officer stepped into the lobby. "The jury has reached a verdict." Morgan and Sarah exchanged a glance before following the crowd back into the packed courtroom. The air was electric with anticipation. Hendrik sat at the defense table, his expression unreadable, as the jury filed back in. The foreman stood, holding a piece of paper. The judge addressed him. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor," the foreman replied. The courtroom collectively held its breath as the foreman began to read. "On the charge of conspiracy to commit hate crimes, we find the defendant, Paul Hendrik, guilty. On the charge of funding and organizing criminal networks, we find the defendant, Paul Hendrik, guilty." The words echoed in the room, followed by a brief stunned silence. Then a murmur spread through the crowd, a mixture of relief and the release of long-held tension. Hendrik's calm facade cracked, his expression twisting with barely concealed rage as the judge began to address sentencing. Outside the courthouse, Morgan stood on the steps, the crisp air filling her lungs as reporters swarmed the building behind her. Sarah joined her, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You did it," Sarah said. "He's finally going to face justice." Morgan didn't smile, though. The weight on her shoulders felt a little lighter, though Morgan knew this was just one battle in a much larger war. "There are others like him out there," Sarah said firmly, her expression resolute, "and you'll deal with them too. But for now, this is a win. Reyes appeared through the swirling crowd, his face lined with exhaustion but carrying a note of satisfaction. They're recommending the maximum sentence. Hendrik won't see the outside of a cell for a long time. Morgan nodded, her voice steady. Good. That's where he belongs. The crowd buzzed with energy around them, reporters pushing for statements, while members of the community shared quiet looks of relief. Morgan allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction. Justice had been served. But the weight of the fight ahead still loomed. The battle against hate was far from over, but today they had taken a meaningful step forward. The air felt lighter, though the gravity of everything that had transpired still hung heavy in her chest. Paul Hendrik was going to prison, his empire of fear and hate dismantled brick by brick. Yet, Morgan knew this was only the beginning. Sarah returned, handing her a cup of coffee. You should be proud of this, you took them down. Morgan took a slow sip, letting the warmth calm the ache in her ribs from the earlier confrontation. It's a start, but this was bigger than Hendrik. There are others like him, people who think they can hide behind their money and power while pulling the strings. Sarah nodded, her expression pensive. At least Tank and his crew are off the streets, and their cooperation helped bring the whole thing crashing down. Morgan's jaw tightened at the mention of Tank and his gang. They were all facing sentences of their own, their cooperation with authorities having lightened their consequences. Tank in particular had been pivotal in exposing Hendrik's network, though Morgan knew it was self-preservation, not remorse, that had motivated him. They'll pay for what they did, Morgan said firmly, even if it's not as much as they deserve. They chose to help themselves, and it just happened to help the case. Sarah hesitated. Do you think they'll ever change? Morgan shook her head, her voice unyielding. That's not my concern. My concern is making sure people like them can't hurt anyone else. And for now, they can't. Behind them, Reyes approached with a folder tucked under his arm. His tired features softened slightly as he joined them. The sentencing for Tank's crew is set for next month. Tank will get at least 10 years and the others are looking at 5 to 7, depending on how much the court values their cooperation. Morgan pressed her lips into a thin line. That's enough to keep them from terrorizing anyone for a while. Reyes shifted, looking slightly uncomfortable. It's not perfect, but their testimony was the key to taking down Hendrik. Without it, he'd still be walking free. Morgan didn't respond immediately. She knew Reyes was right, but the reduced sentences still left a bitter taste. Regardless, Hendrik's conviction was the real victory. It wasn't just about one man, it was about sending a message to anyone who thought they could use fear and violence as weapons of control. Later that evening, Morgan found herself sitting on the same park bench where it had all started. The bruises on her ribs were fading, but the memory of that day remained sharp. She thought about the gang cornering her, the venom in their words, the hatred that had driven them. They had underestimated her, as so many others had before them, and it had sealed their fate. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the park. Morgan stood, inhaling deeply. Her work wasn't done, but for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to pause. Justice had been served, and for now, that was enough. End of Chapter 7. The Wild West of Summerland. Justice had been served, and for now, that was enough. Thank you for following Morgan's journey. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to stay updated on the next powerful narrative.